Welcome to the European Dialogue podcast, brought to you by the EU Values Network, where we bring you thoughtful conversations with the scholars and practitioners shaping Europe today. In this episode, we're taking a closer look at one of the EU's most pressing internal challenges, the rule of law conflict. Our guest is Gisela Hernández, an expert on the dynamics of rule of law enforcement and compliance in the European Union. Gisela is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Public Goods and Policies of the Spanish National Research Council and Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Her research is at the forefront of understanding how the EU navigates the tension between its legal principles and the political realities within member states. So we're really excited to learn from her today. And in today's conversation, we will unpack the insights from two of her recent articles. Together, these works, both co-authored with Carlos Closa, offer a timely look at the evolving rule of law landscape in the EU, one marked by increasing polarisation, strategic enforcement, and institutional pushback. So grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a really great episode from the European Dialogue. Welcome to the show, Gisela.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with you today.
Before we dive into the complexities of EU rule of law enforcement, I would love to ask you, what first sparked your interest in researching democracy and the rule of law in the EU? Was there a particular moment or an event that made you say, this is what I want to focus on?
It was actually a mixture of things. First of all, I was quite convinced about pursuing a research career when I finished my bachelor's. And during my master's, I read a lot about this topic. The media was publishing a lot on this, and academia was starting to put a lot of focus on the rule of law issue, mostly from a law perspective, which I also found interesting because I must say that law scholars have put the foundations on this topic, but at that time there was not much research from a political science perspective somehow, which is my background actually. I was shocked by the paradox that the European Union has this strong conditionality before you enter the Union for enlargement and so on, and that afterwards it could do nothing for enforcing the rule of law and for making member states to comply with democratic standards. Also, that moment, my master's coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic, and during that time, a lot of governments took some reforms that were not very much in line with democracy and the rule of law, neither. On a more personal note, I must say that I also lived in Poland for a year when I was doing my bachelor. So the thing that this rule of law crisis was going on basically in Hungary and Poland was also something interesting to me. Yeah, so I would say a mixture of things, basically.
Thank you very much for sharing that process with us. And wow, my goodness, what a very interesting time to have had that experience in Eastern Europe. So now, turning to one of your articles we want to discuss today, titled Turning Assertive, EU Rule of Law Enforcement in the Aftermath of the War in Ukraine, co-authored with Carlos Closa, you explore how the war has shaped the European EU's approach to enforcing the rule of law. Let's turn to, say, a concrete example of an EU country that has challenged the Union's priorities in this area, Hungary, for instance. Its notably, let's say, friendly relationship with Russia has raised a lot of questions about the EU's external policy making. Could you explain for our listeners a little bit about the Hungarian position?
Wow, there is a lot of things to say about the Hungarian position. Okay, as the listeners probably know, Hungary has been on the a hotspot because of this rule of law crisis. I mean, it's the country in which we have experienced the most democratic recession and a rule of law deficit. In fact, it is the only EU country nowadays that it's no longer a democracy, but it is even labeled as a electoral autocracy. So once the Russian war against Ukraine started in February 2022, what we observed was a very strong response on the part of most EU leaders. They publicly condemned the aggression. Conversely, Hungary was very reluctant to make a firm stance in favor of Ukraine. The Hungarian government was not very much willing to criticize the Russian position. So this was from the very beginning a very important difference with the rest of EU countries. I mean, the Hungarian government said, I think the European Union must stay out of the war. and I'm not in favor of imposing sanctions to Russia and to send aid to Ukraine. So yeah, a very different position from that of the rest of the European Union. We could say that at the beginning this position was more made through statements and certain reluctancies, but until April 2022, Hungary was more willing to cooperate with the sanctions thing. However, once Viktor Orban was reelected in April 2022 in the country, the position became harder. His stance stronger, condemning Russia and helping Ukraine was stronger. Not only rhetorically, but also he started to impose vetoes on sanctions packages, fundamentally hindering the capacity of the European Union to act on this regard. Also, the Hungarian government tried to obtain some benefits from this, particularly through manipulating the number of refugees arriving in the country. The Hungarian government tried to obtain more from the asylum and migration funding of the European Union by positioning itself as very welcoming to refugees, while it was not that much. And yeah, basically, it started to put an obstacle to consensual decision making in the council to approve the sanctions packages, which was very, how to say, like risk strategy somehow, because it has become very, I think it has become very costly for Hungary, this position, because at the end, it has led to a certain degree of isolation of this government in the country since these moments of the early year, I mean of the early moments of the Russian invasion against Ukraine. The Hungarian government has proved willing to put vetoes not only on sanctions but also on other issues, like for instance the global tax, the accession to NATO of Sweden and Finland. Now we are experiencing some trouble with the Hungarian position on defense spending, fundamentally differing, no, from the position that the other EU countries have taken.
And how has the Hungarian attitude affected the priorities then of the EU, especially when it comes to rule of law enforcement? How did the different member states' governments of the EU respond to the Hungarian position?
As I mentioned before, this Hungarian position has been costly. On the one hand, of course, for the rest of the council, because taking action is more difficult. Having to deal with Hungary, it's always a trouble. But it also has been costly for the Hungarian government itself. I mean, this differing stance on the war makes some governments more willing to condemn the rule of law backsliding in Hungary, which is precisely what we studied in the paper you mentioned before. It's this shift of position. No, we have identified that the council normally has been very reluctant to take a strong stance regarding the rule of law crisis in Hungary. We can identify that there are, of course, different positions. No, there are some members of the council, the so-called friends of the rule of law, which have been more active and more willing to put criticism on the Hungarian government. But normally, the position of the council has been not much willing to really apply sanctions against Hungary. They haven't even voted in order to apply recommendations under Article 7 to the Hungarian government. A strong stance against sanctions to Russia and against sending aid to Ukraine open like a breach with the rest of council members, and even those countries which have been traditionally, how to say it, more sympathetic or less willing to condemn Hungary, normally the Central and Eastern European countries, for instance, became more willing to criticize this attitude of obstructing sanctions. This was particularly visible in the Visegrad 4 group, which is the group of countries of Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. They have been often very united. However, since Hungary took this strong position against sanctions, these governments have distanced somehow themselves from the Hungarian government, particularly during 2022. And also, this attitude opened a breach with the Polish government. At that time, traditionally, the Fidesz party and Law and Justice in Poland have been quite close to each other. However, of course, the position regarding the war was completely different. I mean, Poland has been at the forefront advocating for sanctions, welcoming refugees, asking for a stronger role of Europe in defending Ukraine. And yeah, of course, this was completely the opposite from the Hungarian position. So yeah, Hungary was somehow isolated. A very good example of this was, in fact, the Article 7 hearing that took place in the Council in May 2022. As you know, in the hearings, the countries have the governments have the possibility to put questions to the Hungarian government. And normally, the usual suspects, I mean, the friends of the rule of law, are the ones questioning the Hungarian government. However, in this May 2022 hearing, there was a participation record. A total of 18 delegations put questions. And in fact, some countries, for instance, Estonia, Slovenia, Slovakia, Lithuania, and Latvia, were willing to question the Hungarian government. And the last three were first time questioners. So this is significant because it signals a real shift of the position of these countries from tolerance towards a more assertive stance, saying, okay, we have been dealing a lot of time with your rule of law trouble, but now this thing about Ukraine is too much for us to deal with. Okay, so another good example is that they finally decided to pass the proposal of the Commission for cutting funding to Ukraine to Hungary under the conditionality regulation procedure. So yeah, basically it's a completely shift of position in the council from tolerance to more uh, willingness to condemn the Hungarian attitude.
So interesting that this has actually shown such a remarkable shift in those countries traditionally allied with Hungary, or at the very least active, tolerant, let's say, bystanders. Can you walk us through then how the European Commission's approach has changed and perhaps what drove this change, if any?
Yeah, as well as the council became more assertive, the commission did the same. Traditionally, what we have identified as the commission is very tolerant to rule of law backsliding, in the sense that it has been reluctant to activate some enforcement procedures, particularly against Hungary. I mean, for instance, Article 7 against the Hungarian government was activated by the European Parliament and not by the commission, which is a very different stance on the part of the commission from the one that we have observed regarding the rule of law crisis in Poland. No, the Commission has traditionally been more willing to use the enforcement instruments against Poland than against Hungary. However, the 2022 situation completely changes this, in the sense that the Commission becomes much more assertive as well against Hungary. On the other hand, much more tolerant against the Polish government of law and justice. The most evident signal of this shift is the activation of the conditionality regulation after Orban won the April 2022 election in the country. Like 3 or 4 days later, the Commission decided to activate the conditionality regulation in order to cut funding to Hungary because of the rule of law situation in the country. And yeah, basically, this is an important difference from before, if we compare it with previous times, because the situation in Poland was also very serious at the moment as regards the rule of law. However, the Commission abstained from using the conditionality regulation against the Polish government, despite we have evidence that it was also its intention, because in November 2021, the Commission sent letters to the two governments saying, hey, we are waiting for the Court of Justice to rule on the legality of this regulation. However, if you don't change your situation, you will be likely targets. Nonetheless, it finally only activated the regulation against Budapest. Therefore, I mean, this is a clear signal that this activation of this enforcement procedure is very much linked to the stance of that the different governments took regarding the Russian war against Ukraine. And yeah, basically, it's also a signal that the Commission is very respondent to Council's preferences. Normally, Viktor Orban has been more protected in the Council by the other EPP governments. Somehow, however, once he decides to start breaching consensus and putting obstacles to approving the sanctions in the council, and the council becomes more willing to sanction this Hungarian attitude, the commission is also responding to these council preferences. No, so what we observe here is that, as previous research has established, The Commission is very respondent to Council preferences regarding rule of law enforcement, and also that in activating the different enforcement instruments, it calculates whether these instruments are going to be approved or not in the Council, and also the political gains the Commission is going to get from activating them. So yeah, basically this signal that the Commission is very much of a, I would say, political enforcer rather than a technical enforcer in exercising its role as the guardian of the treaties.
Now let's dive into your most recent research, your 2025 paper titled Unravelling National Government's Positions on EU Rule of Law Enforcement, which is also co-authored with Carlos Closa. You examine why some countries challenge EU rule of law enforcement while others support it. And I know you've touched a little bit on this already today, but if we could expand more on your findings there, how much do factors like a country's economy or perhaps their level of democracy shape its stance on EU law enforcement?
Yeah, this is a paper I really enjoyed writing because I think that our research is novel in the sense that we looked at concrete governments rather than looking at the member states, because this research about different positions regarding the rule of law enforcement has been done mostly from a member states perspective. We put the focus rather on governments because we thought that ideology would be an important thing, that the ideology of the governments in terms of left, right, or Euroscepticism would have an impact. However, we were very much surprised by the fact that when we categorize governments, positions normally remain stable within member states. We created 4 categories of governments, which were the committed pro-enforcers, which are those governments that have been traditionally been very vocal and active in advocating for a stronger role of Europe in enforcing the rule of law, mostly the friends of the rule of law. I mean, the countries in the north of Europe, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Luxembourg, Belgium, and so on. Then we have the soft pro-enforcers, which have been also willing to sanction rule of law backsliding, but in a position from a position of more acquiescence with the friends of the rule of law, like following this lead, which are normally these governments like Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and so on. Then we have the reluctant anti-enforcers, who are the governments in Eastern Europe, like Czech Republic, Slovakia, these kind of governments which have been joining some initiatives, but not advocating for a very strong role of Europe in sanctioning Hungary and Poland, and sometimes have even proved willing to defend these governments vis-a-vis EU action. And finally, we have the strong anti-enforcers, which were, of course, the governments in Poland and Hungary, which were not only reluctant to EU action, of course, because they were the the targets of this action, but also did so from a position of defiance to EU authority, like questioning the authority of the EU to enforce the rule of law in national context. So the interesting thing is that we look at positions from 2016 to 2021. We map a total of 93 governments, I think. We finally got sufficient evidence to establish position of 61 governments, but the positions remain stable within member states. Despite changes of governments, the positions, for instance, within Spain or within Sweden or within Netherlands remain stable. The only exceptions to this trend in which we observed shifts of governments from pro to anti rule of law enforcement positions were Austria, Greece, and Italy. This stability somehow signals that the most important conditions shaping rule of law enforcement preferences are structural and semi-structural factors. Basically, is your self-perception as the possible target of enforcement or the country that is going to be the enforcer somehow. The conditions we observed were very important, were the position on the EU budget first. Basically, if you think about this has a lot of sense because contributors to the EU budget are not very worried about sanctions. In fact, they would be supporting, for instance, the conditionality regulation because they probably don't want their money to go to funding illiberal regimes. And also they are very unlikely to be the targets of such type of sanctions because if you are a contributor to the EU budget, financial sanctions is not something that could hurt your economy that much. On the other hand, if we think about debtors to the EU budget, they are likely to be more averse to monitoring fearing that sanctions could have a very important impact on their economy. So it's basically a self-perception on whether you are going to be the target or the enforcer. It's quite similar for democratic quality. We found that democratic quality is also important in predicting pro rule of law enforcement preferences. And this is because, of course, you perceive like that you are less likely to be sanctioned if your democratic quality is very good. And finally, we also identify a cleavage between the old and new member states, which is also somehow logic in the sense that at the end of the day, it was the older member states, the ones that established the 1993 Copenhagen criteria, and also the ones that designed Article 7, that introduced Article 7 for the first time in the Treaty of Amsterdam and afterwards reformed it in the Treaty of Nice, but with a clear eye on enlargement processes to Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, at the end of the day, Article 7 is a very target instrument. It's designed for Eastern countries. Therefore, for the newer members of the European Union, therefore, your perception is that it's an instrument designed against you, against the countries that have joined the Union in recent times. So yeah, this is basically the explanation that we found the most convincing, that your self-perceptions on being the future objective of enforcement measures or the enforcer determine very much your preferences. However, we must be careful with these findings in the sense that the period we studied was before the Ukraine war. And as I mentioned beforehand, the Ukraine war make some governments, some member states to shift their positions. Therefore, this doesn't mean that positions cannot change if conditions change, but rather than we need further research to check whether this continues to be a convincing explanation in the new era or new period that we are experiencing as a result of this war.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that overview. Indeed, your research does sound very novel. Will you continue this research to include those post 2021, as you've mentioned?
It's going to be a challenge because I mean this Ukraine war has changed a lot of things, and we have seen governments from member states that have traditionally been very reluctant to rule of law enforcement. And also, I mean, we cannot forget that I mean this shift is super influenced by the war, which signals that issue linkage is a very strong mechanism in the council. I mean that countries, governments in the council link issues all the time, and that they are willing to take stronger action on the rule of law, like a way to sanction Hungary because of being a disturbing actor against other things that they consider as a priority, which is, for instance, consensus, not only on sanctions, but on other issues. So, yeah, I would like to continue on this line of research because I think we will find some interesting things. But let's see.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. So, well, staying on that point then you previously made on political ideology, in this same paper that we're discussing, you highlight how political ideology and party politics can shape how governments react to EU rule of law enforcement. And well, with everything happening right now in Europe, elections, shifting alliances, geopolitical tensions, etc., do you see this kind of influence growing, or are there other factors becoming more important that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, also an interesting thing in the paper, as you mentioned, is that we found that despite structural and semi-structural conditions play a very important role in shaping preferences, these positions of defiance against EU authority and completely rejection of the EU authority to enforce the rule of law within national context, which was very much the position of the Polish and Hungarian governments, is very much driven by ideology, by punctuating high on the tan end of the ideological axis, like having a strong traditional authoritarian position, and also to have Eurosceptic views. Therefore, of course, ideology matters, and this is worrying, at least for me somehow, considering that this somehow signals that this rule of law crisis can spread to any member state, and basically that this defiance to the EU integration project and to EU authority can also spread to any member state if governments with similar characteristics take office. And this is very much something we are experiencing nowadays. I mean, in the sense that illiberal alternatives, far-right parties with similar views to those of Fidesz and Law and Justice in Poland, are gaining popularity across Europe. I mean, across all member states, basically. We can see examples in France, in the very recent elections in Germany. Also, in Austria, the FPO was the most voted force, if I remember it correctly. Therefore, I mean, these alternatives are becoming more and more appealing. So, yeah, this definitely put into test the resilience of EU institutions against these illiberal actors, because at the end of the day, these governments are the ones that sit in the council and that take decisions for the whole European Union. And having more Viktor Orban Orbans in the council can be seriously a threat to EU cooperation and to the whole EU integration project. I mean, not only because these type of governments endanger the citizens, the rights of the citizens of the European Union as a whole, in the sense that threats to judicial independence endanger every EU citizen's right to a fair trial and to justice, but also because they normally put a lot of barriers to the rights of collectives like women or the LGBT people. So yeah, they are definitely a threat from the point of view of fundamental rights for all the citizens of the European Union, but also because they are endangering cooperation in the Council in various issues nowadays, such as this defense spending. I mean, nowadays Hungary is a country that is always opposing to these strong stances of Europe against Russia and advocating for a stronger geopolitical role of the European Union in the world. So yeah, basically I feel that the Council is particularly endangered. Is one of the institutions which really whose resilience vis-a-vis these illiberal actors is really going to be put into a test. Not only because these actors can act as delegations in the council, but also because they can significantly influence the EU agenda. For instance, when they are occupying the rotating presidency of the council, which it changes each 6 months among member states. So yeah, basically, I feel this is something that needs further reflection and that it's worrying, and it's going to be definitely a challenge in the upcoming years, because I don't feel these parties are losing popularity, but rather are becoming more and more appealing to the EU public. So
Yeah, yes, it's incredibly worrying to think what lies in store for the future of Europe. If there is that ability, as you've described so well, to have such significant influence in key arenas like the European Council. And well, with that in mind, as a final question for you now, let's imagine someone from the council could be listening to this episode. What steps would you recommend for the EU that we could take to strengthen its rule of law enforcement while maintaining unity and legitimacy, an issue that's so central also to our EU values network? Yeah, the $1 million question, or €1 million, I should say, the €1 million question for you there.
yeah, definitely not an easy question for finishing
No.
this podcast. I mean, now we're here for challenge. Basically, I feel this reflection is fundamental nowadays, and to have a debate about this, but a really informed debate. I feel this is a key question, particularly if we think about enlargement, which is a topic we are talking very much about these days through the Balkan countries, but also enlargement to Ukraine. And yeah, basically, enlargement is nowadays very much discussed from a security perspective. Of course, security considerations have also influenced all previous enlargements. However, I'm not sure how much we can do this trade-off between security and democracy and the rule of law, because our experience is that letting countries enter the union with some rule of law problems, for instance, Romania or Bulgaria in 2008, we joined without fully complying with the Copenhagen criteria, and these countries have maintained their problems regarding judicial independence, organized crime, corruption, and reforms have taken a lot of time and not been fully achieved. So I think we need further reflection on whether we want to do this trade-off between, okay, we can sacrifice to some extent democratic reforms in order to get security gains, because in the longer term I feel this is risky strategy, because once you enter the union, if we don't have strong and really enforceable enforcement mechanisms, these governments which are not willing to comply with rule of law standards, or with member states which have very serious democratic problems, can be a threat for European integration, and can be an obstacle for making decisions in the council and advancing the project. I think these countries at some point need to join the European Union, but that we don't need to be too flexible or not to really enforce the democratic and rule of law requirements for them to join. And also, I think that to improve the enforcement mechanisms we have, not in the sense that I feel that we need more enforcement instruments or something like this. I think the ones we have are already like sufficiently strong. For instance, the conditionality regulation, I feel it's a very strong mechanism with a lot of potential. However, it's not being applied as much as it should. I mean, the use of the conditionality regulation is not only dependent on its legal formulation, but also it's been clear that it's very much dependent on political considerations, and I think this is a threat, because it's being used in the cases in which we are experiencing a country becoming an autocracy rather than a democracy, which is the case of Hungary. But we have serious rule of law and democracy deteriorations in other countries, which I think we could act on before reaching such a serious situation through the conditionality procedure, and the Commission and the Council are proving not willing to do so. So I feel that we need to improve the enforceability of our enforcement instruments. Like this appeasement approach to illiberal reforms does not work. I mean, the Hungarian government has been appeased for years and years, and now is really endangering the European Union, and making advances in the European integration project. I feel this is a critical point. And finally, I also feel that this very much relates to debates on which type of European Union we want in the following years, and particularly which type of institutions do we want, in the sense that we are having a lot of debates about having a more political commission, which of course could be beneficial in terms of approaching or dealing with the EU's democratic deficit, like for connecting the citizens with EU institutions, and that they don't feel that it is EU bureaucrats taking decisions. However, making a more political commission has also some risk, in the sense that if the commission is pursuing its own political agenda rather than acting as a technical and, how to say it, impartial or guardian of the treaties, okay, therefore we don't have an enforcer institution. We have a political institution, which is another type of institution. So I think these debates are also critical. I don't have a, how to say, that strong view or a solution. I would love to, but I don't. But I think these are the debates we're gonna be facing in the upcoming years. And yeah, of course, I think this type of research regarding EU values, rule of law, democracy is going to be of much interest. I mean, in 2024, the Nobel Prize of Economics was given to this Danon Acemoglu and Robinson, who were conducting research precisely on this, on how institutions need to comply with the rule of law, and how having a strong rule of law standards and strong institutional settings contribute to countries' prosperity. And it's the same for the European Union. If we don't have a rule of law culture that embed institutions in the national context and in the European context, the prosperity of the European Union is at risk somehow, no? So I think, yeah, definitely this is going to be a topic that we will talk much about in the upcoming years, definitely.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for those thoughts on what we need from the EU, and a great point on really what we also have to do to prevent democratic backsliding from happening in the first place. With that, Gisela, I am afraid it's all we have time for today, but a really huge thank you on behalf of the EU Values Network for your time and for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to the podcast. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning in today to this lovely podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a comment somewhere. We're on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and you can listen to this through our website as well. So until next time, take care, stay informed, and tune in soon.